values, and vision. And much of the insights that we are sharing today are really coming in from that program, by rolling out that program for a number of organizations. We've obviously reviewed a lot of literature around organization values, but I think the key thing really is the practical insights from rolling out organization values programs and vision programs with organizations of all sizes, small and large organizations. To make the best of the webinar, I would request you to please ask questions as you go by. You don't have to wait towards the end, till the end. I'm looking out for questions on the chat, and I know, Gulshan, you've asked one, and I'm going to answer that. So feel free to ask questions. It is your questions and perspectives that will make the webinar richer. Yes, we're going to share the video, the entire webinar video with you on our website. And in fact, you could watch all the other webinars that we have done till date, over 100 of them on various topics, on the link that has been shared with you. Jane, you've just tested the audio. It's working, so you might want to check at your end. All right, so let's begin the webinar. What I'm going to really do is talk about organization values to begin with, and then get into culture. That's something that's linked to values, and there seems to be a good relationship between the two that we will perhaps try and decode during the webinar. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to the values. I'm going to introduce you to culture. We're going to look at the role of both in the success of an organization's business, their success, and perhaps look at some cultural trends as well. Right. The case study, well, perhaps is a very simple case study, not from human life, but I'm going to talk about that anyways. So what are organizational values? We've just kind of posted some definitions that you would find if you review theory around organization values. You'll find that Schwartz said that organization values can be defined as beliefs about socially or personally desirable end states or actions that are explicitly or implicitly shared by members of an organization. There's another definition, which focuses more on culture, and perhaps Singler has also discussed organization values. What people within the organization think is good for organization, what needs to happen within the organization, and what might be needed within organization in the future. I think the point that I want to really talk about here is the fact that values are something that you are ready to enforce in just about every situation. I'm just being conservative in saying not in all situations. Essentially, that's what you aim for. If honesty is your value, and you would find that many organizations do have that as a value, then you should be able to take action against someone who is not being honest, irrespective of their level of dishonesty, irrespective of their level within the organization, and irrespective of the level of effect that dishonesty would have in the organization. So from a most practical perspective, value is something that you're happy to enforce, that you are bound to enforce all across the organization, right? And that's what makes it a bit different from culture, because I'm going to come back to these some statements of values from various organizations, but where culture comes in is culture is the visible part. Culture is what you see. Culture is how people behave in an organization. We're going to talk a lot more about it. So why do you need values? Why do you need to define values in an organization? Human beings have, we have all standard set of values. Values exist in cultures. Certain cultures value pace, certain cultures value uh, the ability to reflect. Uh, Different cultures place different value on values. Why do you need that for organizations? Because organizations need to bind people together through something that they can relate to. And that's the reason why we say that what values deliver for you is a sense of purpose, right? A sense of purpose because everyone's living for the same values. They help you set standards, set standards of deliveries, set standards of the kind of work you do, how you deliver your tasks. And then if you do have good values, that's going to help you attract good customers and employees both together. So values are not just for binding people, but also attracting people, for also attracting customers, and for defining how you work, how you do your tasks, how do you go about your daily life in an organization. Um, Here's a quick poll for you. I'm going to request my colleagues to actually launch the poll here. Let me see if I am able to. Yes. What are the factors that drive organizational value? If you could try and answer that for me, go ahead and put your words. Which is the factor which drives organizations' values? Is it their culture? Is it their strategy or brand? Um, is it the way decisions are taken within the organization? Um, if I were to create values for an organization or determine the values, what should I look at? Should I look at the culture? Should I look at the brand? Should I look at how decisions are made within the organizations, how communication happens, or what are the individual values, especially of the leaders? Leaders right uh, at the top who are influential. What kind of values drive them as an individual? Or should I look at the industry? There are different values that different industries have. Farming, for example, has very different set of values than a pharmaceutical company or a Bitcoin company. Um, or perhaps I should look at what has brought us success in the past. All right. I'm going to end the poll in, say, 30 seconds. So if you still have a decision to make, please go ahead and do that. We have about 10 responses. It's always good to have a few more. All right. So I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. Okay. I hope you're all able to see the results now. What we see here is that the group is really swinging towards organization culture or modes of contact. And I do agree that organization culture and modes of contact are perhaps contributing factors to the organization values. I do personally believe that from a very practical perspective, having worked with a number of organizations in helping them determine their values, a lot of time conversation steers towards determining the individual values of the leaders. And that's perhaps been overwhelming. So when you determine the organization's values, you've got to look at all of these factors. All these factors are important. What is the organization's culture? When you say culture, we mean what are some of the common behaviors that you see within the organization? What kind of brand do you stand for? And what kind of brand would you like to have as an organization? How are decisions taken? Do you see a pattern in the way decisions are taken or communications done within the organization? Is there a certain pace to it? Is there a certain kind of orientation? Is it oriented towards business? Is it oriented towards how people feel. Is it future oriented, or is it kind of stuck in the past? So you look at those orientation and pace perspectives, the context with which that communication happens and those decisions are taken. Industry is also important, and I'm going to just kind of show you different cultures emerging from different industries in a bit. And then perhaps one of the important factors is success factors. Think about two organizations coming together, and that's a classic case of dilemmas in determining values. Let's say two different organizations are merging together to form one organization. How would you define the values of the new organization? Would you look at the culture? Would you look at their marketing strategy, what they want to stand for? Would you look at how decisions are made in the new organization, or the individual values or success factors? I'd like to maybe perhaps see a few responses in the chat as well. But if you were merging two organizations, which factor would you consider the most to determine the new values? Any ideas would help. This is a classic consulting case in organization values. When there's a merger, there's an acquisition, and we need to recreate the values of the organization. What could indicate, or what could take us through, to the new values? There are two perspectives, and that's the conundrum here. The first perspective is, Shefali, thanks for putting up your thoughts. I see that you're saying it's a combination. It could be derived more out of marketing strategies as well. Yeah, so absolutely, and perhaps strategies, and not just marketing, but all strategies. So the dilemma here is that do you arrive at the values by looking at the past, looking at what has made you successful? What kind of factors have contributed to that success? For example, were there certain values in the right decisions that you took as an organization? So you kind of go back into the history of, let's say, last 5 years and say, what are some of those top 5, 10, 15 decisions that some of the top leaders made on a day-to-day basis? It could have been a simple decision like letting someone go in the organization, or hiring someone, or making a decision of getting into a new territory, what in a market. How were those decisions made? Is there a certain value that kind of came out of there? And therefore that contributed to the success of the organization. Or what is the internal climate in the organization? What kind of values we see preserved in the communication between, let's say, a manager and an employee, a leader and managers? What are some of the values that ex-employees come back and remember, and they tend to think about and they recall easily? So hindsight is really about looking at the present and the past of the organization, and then saying what has worked for us. Let us try and distill that out, and kind of create a decoction and create a set of values, right? The other way to look at values is from a future perspective and say, what kind of values would get us success? So if you're able to first create a vision of the organization, and then based on that vision, determine what's going to get us there, and I'm not really talking about the business drivers. I'm really talking about these softer aspects. Softer aspects like going back to the same thing, decision making. How are employees engaged? What makes people stay in the organization? What kind of values are they not able to relate to, and therefore they leave the organization? And so typically in a values project, you have to take not just the hindsight approach, but also sometimes the foresight approach. Many consultants I've spoken to and we've worked with tend to steer more towards the foresight approach, whereas a number of them, tend to kind of look at what's happening right now and then determine the values. I personally believe that it has to be a combination of both. You need to have, look into the hindsight, and you need to kind of have a foresight. Even if there are certain values that have worked for you in the past, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going for you, are going to work for you in the future, given that the markets are changing, and we're all living in this VUCA world where change is given, um, and something that is constant is kind of becoming rare. So, and how do you do that? How do you create foresight? You not only create that foresight by talking only to the leaders, but you also talk to the employees, because culture is prevalent, is omnipresent in the organization. And if value is related to cultures, and if value needs to be expressed in every decision that is made in the organization, then employees are a great stakeholder in that conversation. And therefore, you have to take both the top-down and a bottom-up approach, to actually arrive at the organization's values. As I go further, if there are any questions or perspectives, please feel free to share them on the chat, and I'll pick them up from there. So let's take a moment and define, kind of differentiate between values and cultures. When we're talking about values, we are saying ethics, we're saying principles, we're saying what are you ready to enforce, as we said earlier, right? Um, and when we're saying culture, we are saying behaviors, what's visible, what's also changing all the time, right? Cultures are always under constant threat, sometimes in the positive direction and sometimes in the negative direction. But cultures are in a state of flux. There is always some movement there. When you hire new people and a lot of them from the same organization, then they're going to bring a bit of that organization into the culture of the organization. So culture is something which is more dynamic, which is in a state of flux. Values, compared to cultures, is kind of more static, and it defines the ethos or principles of the organization. Another way to look at it is from a visibility perspective, which is that values are not seen so easily, right? So if you look at an iceberg, 90% of the iceberg is underwater. And that's where values and beliefs come in. Whereas culture is something that's more visible in an organization. So when we really get into culture projects, when you're looking at helping organizations determine their winning culture and work on that path, it is important for us to actually first look at the values and then get into the culture component. So you start with values, you determine what those values are, and then you determine how they're going to be expressed, in what form are they going to be expressed, and that's where you come up with the culture. Yeah. So again, just continuing on the definition of culture. Culture is about expression, right? And it's not just about the values and beliefs, but it's about how they are expressed in the day-to-day form. How people come together, how they resolve conflicts, how Um, they make decisions and communication, and that's something that we've already discussed a couple of times. So what do you look for when you're looking at organization culture? You look for things like rituals. Um, if you were to look at everyday work rituals in, let's say, a Japanese organization, um, it would tell you um, what the culture is and what is it like to work in that organization. So so the symbols and the rituals that you see on top that people follow. How do meetings happen in an organization? Who speaks first in the meeting? Is it the leader, or is it the junior most person, or is it the person who has the brightest idea? Um, simple rituals in everyday conversations at work will give you a perspective of the culture. Um, Now, how do we balance uh, lived and espoused values with respect to hindsight and foresight approach? All right, thanks. Great question, Elora. Um, when we are looking at the hindsight, we are really looking at, let me go back there. Um, when we're really looking at the hindsight, we are looking at the values that have been lived, that have been demonstrated, right? Um, Hindsight is not about what values did you have in the past, and therefore how do we change them to make them more relevant for the future. I think when you look at the hindsight, you look at what values worked for you and which are the values that you actually found difficult to even enforce. Those are not your values. Those are just statements which never got where the rubber never met the road, right? And so I would I would correlate hindsight with lived values. Foresight is about the future. What's the brand we like to have with employees, with customers? What kind of business strategy will make us successful? What's happening in the market? What's happening to our competitors? Consider all those aspects to determine what values work in the future. So the espoused values are essentially about the future, and lived values are essentially about hindsight. That's how I would relate to it. I just want to make sure, Elora, that I answered your question. Please say yes on the chat if you're okay with that answer. And if you have a follow-up question, please feel free to put in that question again. Okay. So, yeah, going forward, now let's look at, uh, the importance of culture, because values are important because they tell you what to tolerate and what not to tolerate, right? As we said right at the beginning of the webinar, that values are really about what are you ready to enforce. But culture is not like that. Culture is about what you practice on a daily basis. How do you welcome a new employee? How do you, what kind of practices you follow, in terms of team integration? How do you celebrate? How do you reward people? Is there a culture that sets you apart, differentiates you as an organization? So cultures are unique. A lot of times, values are not unique. If you were to do a quick study of various organizations and see how many of them have honesty as a value or integrity as a value, you'll find a lot of them. If you see customer centricity as a value, many organizations have that defined as a value. But cultures are not like that. Cultures are unique. Cultures are they also, there is something called a style ritual, right? It differentiates you. It tells you how things are done about here. What's the way of life in this organization? So, what do? They kind of created identity. They help very much like values. Cultures uh, do have an influence on what customers think of you and what employees think of you. Um, it creates a sense of belongingness, and therefore makes employees more accountable as well. And perhaps it gives you a sense of identity, right? Those are some of the things that are delivered directly by organization culture. Before I come to some data points, perhaps look at these four different perspectives of culture. I've tried not to use the typical types of cultures that you see in management books, but really something that we can relate to in a day-to-day life. Look at how sea pirates work. They see an opportunity, they see a ship passing by, they get together quickly into an agile team. They value swiftness, they value um, camaraderie, fellowship. They go, they attack the ship, get the booty to the shore, and they dissipate. That's a sea culture. That's a sea pirate culture. If you look at pursuit teams in organizations, they operate like sea pirates. People from different divisions come together, follow a pursuit, follow a business opportunity, make it happen, come back and kind of dissipate, and then the delivery takes over and they kind of deliver that service. In some organizations, you will see a more bureaucratic culture, which is really about systems and processes. And when bureaucratic culture goes wrong, it becomes red tapeism, right? And that's what it is. A culture which is very different from the sea pirate culture is a farmer culture. You don't look at opportunities; you create opportunities. You sow seeds. You cultivate the land. You toil it, you work through it, you of course wait for the rains, and if not, then you find a way to cultivate land, and then finally you harvest in a planned manner. So you're not really looking out for opportunities. It's not like a hunter thing, but it's more like farming. And I'm not really talking from just the sales perspective, but from the ethos of the organization. How things are done. Are you an organization that works towards building capability ahead of the opportunity? Um, do you believe in following processes and doing things in time, and therefore deliver results? Or you look out for opportunities and kind of go after them and deliver results? So the pace of the two organizations is very different. The way decisions are taken is different. What you value is different. One values patience and the other values camaraderie or swiftness. So there's a difference in the two. Or something like a doctor culture or a medical culture where there is a culture of constant improvement of self, right? You're not just of service, but also of the fact that I need to improve my competence to deliver better. And therefore, there's a lot of focus on learning and improving one's own capability as an individual and perhaps as a team. Surgeries, for example, are teamwork. But also doctors are also, a lot of times solo workers. And so, but the focus here is a learning culture, right? Out of all these cultures, these cultures may be different, but sometimes their values may be similar. So same values can be expressed differently in different industries and in different contexts. So if I'm really looking at culture, I'm going to figure out, I really need to understand what industry I'm coming from. Shefali, yes. I think industry or the kind of work you do plays a big role in the culture that you have. but not necessarily the values. Values do have an element of industry as well, but I think industry largely influences the culture that you have, right? Um, and so it's important to, so when you start working on the culture, you also start looking at, um, because it's changeable and it's more dynamic, uh, what's going to be more important in a shorter term. You know, values, when you look at values, you perhaps look at years, right? 10 years ago, when we would run a visioning exercise, organizations would come, in the strategic offsite leadership, we would look at a 10-year vision or a 5-year vision for the organization. Difficult for organizations to think beyond an year and a half or two. So because the visions are becoming more shorter term than earlier, 2 years is long term now. So is the perspective of a winning culture. But values are still remaining pretty much static. Values are not changing as the changes that we see in the culture, right? That's the other part that I wanted to highlight here. Okay. So here's another aspect, and I think this is perhaps the right theoretical kind of way to look at culture, which is to say that there are observable parts of the culture which we spoke about, for example, rituals and symbols, and they kind of indicate what culture you have. This is all about observable behaviors, and under those observable behaviors are values and beliefs, like we saw in the iceberg model. And then finally, what you have are the assumptions. Now, that's even deeper, not just invisible, but sometimes it's very difficult to become aware of what are some of the assumptions that you make here. A very simple example I thought I would take in for this is a bees example. Like we were talking about the sea pirates culture and the farmers culture, we could actually talk about culture of beeness, a strong beeness culture. Now, what's a business culture or a culture like bees? If you were to go and kill a bee in a beehive, you know, you can be almost certain that you're going to get attacked by the entire swarm of bees. They would all kind of come and take on anyone who uh, kills a fellow bee. The observable behavior is that they're attacking you. The value that the set of bees have is solidarity. But what's the value that's driving solidarity? The value that's driving solidarity is that my survival is based on the survival of others. In fact, for bees, and I just want to take a few minutes here, though it's something which is not directly relevant. But I think if you look at the evolutionary meaning of this behavior, we tend to protect. We've evolved to protect the gene pool that we have. And when we say that we protect the gene pool, we don't know about it. We know our behaviors and values we don't explicitly talk about that assumption when we talk about values and observable behaviors. But the tendencies that we have are of protecting our gene pool, and that is why it is very difficult for us to believe that one person can kill another person, right? Because you're basically killing someone who belongs to that same gene pool. But it's very easy for us to kill a mosquito. Just because one living being is irritating you in your ears while you're speaking to someone else, you just turn around and you clap and you kill that mosquito. You finish your life. The value we place on living beings who are closer to our gene pool or in our gene pool is far more than the value we place on the people who are outside the gene pool, or the living beings which are outside that gene pool. And therefore the underlying assumption which is driving that value is that um, the purpose of life is to protect one's gene pool and to procreate and protect the gene pool. And so that creates the value of not harming others. And that results in an outward behavior that, we protect our people, we protect humans, and we protect other living beings. There's a nice Arab, saying in the Arab world, it says that I against my brother, um, which means that my gene pool, my own gene pool as an individual, um, is obviously more dear to me than the gene pool of my brother, who has a very close gene pool, but not really mine. And therefore, it's me against my brother. But it's me and my brother against my cousin, because that's one step further. And the level of gene pool or genes I share with my cousin is much lower. My brother is uh, far closer to me genetically. Me and my brother and my cousin against the world. And if I can stretch that, in the story of for bees, because all the bees in the beehives have similar gene pool, they place the same value on the life of their fellow beehive bee, than they place on themselves, and therefore they're ready to kill themselves or die protecting their fellow bee. What we're really saying here is that culture or common behaviors have values underneath, but values underneath have an unsaid implicit assumption. And it's important to understand what that assumption is to be able um, to really understand the values that are driving an organization. So, what's the role of a leader? In driving that culture, the role of the leader is really at two levels. One is to drive culture. How do you learn behaviors? You learn behaviors consciously or unconsciously by modeling others. And therefore, by practicing the rituals and the symbols of the organization, leaders create a way for others to imitate that. They become the role model. And the second most important thing here is to be able to take decisions that protect the values. So sometimes when things go wrong, when there is a critical decision, let's say there is someone who's harmed a client, his business, but if you let this person go, business is going to be harmed. But this person hasn't, behaved with the values of the organizations, keeping the values in mind. Do you go for short-term benefit of the business, or do you go um, for the values? Those are the dilemmas that leaders face every day. And I think what leaders really do is that they reinforce the values by making decisions based on the values of the organization. So from a culture's perspective, role modeling, and from a values perspective, reacting, and making decisions, especially in critical decisions, in those moments of truth, if we can call them that. Those are the two roles that to me are most important for a leader. I think obviously you can expand that and add many more. So what are we seeing now? What we're seeing is that almost all organization cultures are in a state of huge flux, especially with the COVID. There are organizations that are becoming, most organizations are looking at, flexible schedules, working virtually, and that's kind of creating new kinds of symbols and rituals. It's becoming difficult to enforce values um, that one is able to when you're working right in front of your manager's eyes and working in the organization, in the office, versus value. All right, I'm hoping that it's working now. I had an audio issue. So what we're talking about is, are you all able to see my screen? That okay. So what we're talking about is the fact that cultures are in a state of flux, and um, values are being challenged because there is greater focus on employees at the moment, and there is greater focus on sustaining and continuity of business. Cultures would change, but we do not expect that organizations would completely relook at their values in the current circumstances, right? And I think that's a thought that I wanted to leave you with and say, where do you think values would change? What would happen for you to reconsider your values as an organization? Is it the change of business? Is it a merger and acquisition? Would that make you change your values? Or would a black swan event like COVID would make you reconsider your values? What would make you reconsider values? I think that's a very valid question for a number of organizations. I don't think there is one answer to that question, but I do know that organizations are okay to change the culture, but they're not okay to change the values in the short term. Those are some of the aspects that I thought would be good for us to discuss. It'll be great for you to ask questions if you have any follow-up questions. I'm pretty much towards the end of the webinar, perhaps a few minutes ahead. I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the upcoming conversations, some of the upcoming programs that we have. As an organization, we do this certification for various HR, LNOD folks. So if you are looking at getting certified on DISC, on competency mapping or instructional designing, I think, be in touch with us. These are all online, live virtual programs. We are not yet back to in-person programs for any of these. And these have always been, delivered in the virtual mode as well. We also have a program, Jamawar, where a lot of organizations are looking at the program for resetting their strategy. And when I say strategy, I always share and values, especially in this post-COVID era where previous strategies have been
So I see, I'm sorry, I'm shifting the system. What's the merit in conducting cultural surveys? Shefali, great value in cultural surveys from the perspective of determining what is the experience of employees in the current organization, in the current state, right? And so, if you go back to the point where we were looking at hindsight and foresight, I think surveys are essentially looking at the hindsight, right? And they help you determine what's working well, what kind of, it also helps you determine where and what kind of rituals, what kind of culture, where do you need to improve in terms of your culture. So culture surveys are a very important aspect in determining where you need to make a change. But if you're really looking at crafting a winning culture, what kind of culture would help you get to your goals? That's a slightly different exercise, so the definition of the winning culture, you don't really have to do a culture survey. But to find the gap and to actually roll out or imbibe that culture, you need to be doing a culture survey. That's when you know where to act, what to work on. I hope that answers your question, Shafali. All right. All right. Thank you very much. So I would, with that, see if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I would like to close the webinar a few minutes ahead of time. Jane, I just changed the system, so I've taken the slides off. We'll be happy to share the recording of the webinar on our website, and all those who have attended the webinar will get a link to that shortly. All right, so you'll have access to that. Thank you very much. And that's also the link that's available right on the chat. We're posting that again on the chat. You could look at this link in a couple of days and you'll find the recording available. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.